I have some clients that don't want to receive good legal advice, and they choose not to, and it costs the state dearly.
Well, that lawsuit, and the relationship between the legislature and the AG's office were all brought up in last night's debate between Republican candidates for the state's attorney job. Incumbent Lawrence Wasden, who you just heard from, summed up what he has seen over the last 2 decades in office, specifically the last few years. The 3 candidates from last night: trial lawyer and former Congressman Raul Labrador, who ran unsuccessfully for governor in 2018, Art Macomber, North Idaho real estate property rights attorney, and incumbent Wasden, the longest serving AG in state history, running for his 6th term. When asked about that relationship between the AG's office and the legislature, here's what he said.
There should be a mutual respect. However, the legislature is the legislative branch of government. The Attorney General is in the executive branch of government. There's checks and balances on each side. It's not going to be a perfect relationship, nor should it be. My function under the law is to give them legal advice, and it is also to help them to try and improve their legislation, which we do. But you're going to have a certain number of them that simply don't want to receive that advice, and they get to make the policy choices. I'm not telling them what they get to choose. I'm giving them legal advice. They choose that, and then I represent the policy choices once they make them.
Wasden mentioned on one occasion he had a legislator who told him, "We can do anything we want because we're the Idaho legislature," to which Wasden had to remind them, "No, actually you can't. You're limited by the Constitution." Meanwhile, Labrador says while it may not always be a friendly relationship, as AG, he hopes to have a better working one with the legislature.
So we have 2 problems with what the Attorney General just said. Number one is that he keeps blaming his client. The worst kind of lawyer is the lawyer that keeps blaming his clients for the bad relationship, or blames the client for the cases that they lose. I think they have a problem because he keeps talking down to the legislature instead of talking with the legislature and working with them. But the number one issue that we have, and I noticed this when I was a legislator, was I couldn't believe that the Attorney General's office was actually giving legal counsel to the legislature and the legislative branch. I actually think that the legislative branch should have its own attorneys. But the best thing that an Attorney General can do is ensure that whatever the legislature passes is written in a way that can be defended in the courts.
To which Wasden said they do through the opinions that they are asked of during the session. Well, Labrador said if you have an attorney general that is trusted by the legislature, well, they'll usually and actually follow the council instead of constantly butting heads, pointing to the fact lawmakers did try to take away some of the AG office funding because of that animosity. Macomber said the fundamental problem with the relationship is the problem with the separation of powers.
You have a conflict of interest when the legislature goes next door to the executive branch. These branches are having adversarial relationships. That's the way the republics are designed. I will measure what the legislative burden is in the Attorney General's office, and I will fire those attorneys and take those positions and put them back in the legislature, work with the legislature to create a legal counsel's office for the legislature. That's what they need.
Okay, so that was just a part of the hour-long debate that went on last night on IPTV. Let's bring in Morgan Romero now, who you were on the panel for the debates last night.
I was one of 3 reporters on that panel. I have to admit it was a fun, interesting debate, maybe not to be expected of an attorney general debate, but it really was. Brian, because they're all attorneys, they were relatively well behaved, we'll give them that. This was really a debate between, the establishment, another political insider, and an outsider. That was brought up quite a bit. All candidates call themselves constitutionalist conservatives, but of course they did go at it over a number of different things.
Okay, so we heard what they talked about at length, that relationship between the AG's office and the legislature. There was another point right after that. I believe you brought it up. What about that relationship between the AG and the governor's office?
We did ask specifically about that. Macomber and Labrador criticized Wasden for sort of always siding with or agreeing with Governor Little, specifically during the pandemic and when Little exercised those emergency powers. So I asked Wasden, are you willing to push back on Governor Little if he gets reelected? His answer was he does have a difference of opinion with the governor. He cited the land board, for example, both of them on that. He said when Little asks him to be his lawyer, though, it's his job and responsibility to represent the governor and argue in his defense. Otherwise, he violates the law. He says that's how it works with any attorney and client. The client decides whether or not to take your legal advice, and then you represent them in court if and when they get sued, right? Laid out in the state constitution, the attorney general's job is to legally represent several state agencies and offices, not just the governor. And given the fact that both Labrador and Macomber are critical of Little, I asked them if they'd be able to work with him if he gets reelected. They said yes, they have to be cordial with all state officers, but the candidates did say that they'd push back against Little more than Wasden is, and that they'd stand up, to any executive branch overreach.
This idea of putting attorneys in the legislature to offer these opinions kind of, I guess, as things are happening, something that Macomber said hasn't been in effect since 1997. So that's something that I think we're going to kind of look into ourselves. But
that is interesting.
What about this federal government overreach kind of thing that also was brought up a couple of times?
Essentially, they said they don't believe Wasden has been aggressive enough in standing up to federal government overreach. They think he's too passive in defending Idaho's sovereignty. Wasden argued he files lawsuits against the federal government, we cover them here at KTVB, when he has a legitimate cause of action. And that, of course, is weighing the facts and weighing the law. Take a listen.
You don't join lawsuits simply because you want to gain political popularity or have your face on Fox News. You have to have a proper cause of action to bring. We join when we have a cause of action. We sue the federal government. I sued the federal government over vaccine mandates. I've sued the government repeatedly.
Wasden says he reads the Constitution and he does what it says, even when it's not politically popular. Of course, we couldn't get to all the questions we wanted to ask since the debate was just an hour. I do wish, Brian, that we could have asked Wasden. One of our follow-up questions was, what if McGeehan gets elected? Would he be willing to work with her, given the fact that she's accused his office of giving bad advice in the past?
And his answer, or you would like to ask that question?
That would
have been an interesting question to answer, yes.
If we're able to have the attorney general candidates on in some format on KTVB, because we're not doing that AG debate, we'd love to ask those questions.
Speaking of questions, I'd like to ask you about Raul Labrador. He's been kind of in the background since 2019 when he left his spot in U.S. Congress. He was the head of the Idaho GOP. Then he's now and currently on the CDH board, Central District Health Board.
Right.
Some people kind of accusing him like this is kind of a stepping stone thing for him.
That was actually one of our first questions as panelists was why you? You ask these candidates, why you? Why do you really want this job, Congressman Labrador? And he said, he believes he's the best person for the job and kind of gave his campaign speech in that way. But to your point, he left Congress, served in the Idaho GOP, is a practicing trial attorney for Skog Law out in Nampa. And I think that is on a lot of people's minds. He ran an unsuccessful race for governor. So is this just the next step because he's an attorney? Is this the next step? And he says no.
Like he has higher goals other than attorney general.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Is this the stepping stone to reach governor at some point in the future? And we'll see, but he said no.
All right. Thank you very much, Morgan. And speaking of we'll see, KTVB, we're going to host our first debate coming up on Tuesday night, Republican candidates for state superintendent. You can watch that starting at 6 o'clock right here on Channel 7 and KTVB.com. Thanks, Morgan.
You bet.